Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 gives you the option to live out the fantasy of being a lethally strong vampire, decapitating heads and drinking blood. However, it can also be incredibly brutal if you don't know what you're doing. While combat isn't always the answer to getting through many of the game's problems, you're most likely going to need to learn a few tips if you want to survive. So here are 8 brutal combat tips for Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2. While open combat is always an option when dealing with the various enemy factions in Bloodlines 2, it's best to keep it to a minimum as often as you can. How you start an engagement is vitally important, so it's best to observe your enemies from a hidden location and pick them off one by one, sick them on each other, disorient them, or fight them in small groups before disappearing into the shadows once more. You're given a lot of combat abilities as you work on filling out your build, but most are only useful for taking care of a small handful of enemies at once, and as soon as bigger enemies with larger health bars and more lethal weapons start being added to the mix, diving into open combat with a large group is basically a death sentence, since you can't restore health or blood safely when being attacked. Additionally, at the current time of writing, Bloodlines 2 also has some performance issues when engaging in fights with big groups, which can mean dying a frustrating death as a result of choppy frame rates. The vast majority of the footage in this video was captured on a PC that was above the recommended specs, and the rest was captured on PS5 if that gives you any frame of reference for how Bloodlines 2 runs. It's possible that performance will be fixed as patches roll out, but in general, it's best to stick to the shadows and prey on unsuspecting enemies as often as you can. When trying to keep a low profile, you'll want to perform stealth kills as often as possible to thin out the ranks of goons patrolling the streets and underbelly of Seattle. Staying hidden usually means crouching as you pick your next target. However, it's vitally important to know that you're reducing your options for stealth attacks when crouched above most enemies. As you'll see in the footage here, sometimes you're not able to perform a stealth kill on an enemy if you're crouching while on a platform above them, but when you stand up, it becomes an option. I spent far too much time with Bloodlines 2, assuming that, for whatever reason, there were some enemies that I couldn't hit with stealth assassinations. Turns out, it was the angle I was looking down at them from while crouched. You'll notice that if you get dangerously close to the edge of the platform you're on while crouching, you should be able to pull off a stealth kill. However, I found myself accidentally dropping down on top of enemies when attempting to line things up that way. Instead, I'd recommend getting the drop on the enemy from above by lying in wait while crouched, and then as soon as they get in stealth kill range, standing up and quickly hitting the contextual button prompt to perform the kill before crouching again to get back into a stealthier stance. There are some abilities that you can unlock that allow you to slow down time in combat. However, you can actually do that right from the jump. When in combat, hold down the left trigger to bring up the ability menu. When you do, things will slow down and you'll be given the chance to take a second to figure out what your next move is. With combat as frantic as vampires, this breathing room is essential for making sure that you're not going to get demolished by a charging brute type enemy or shot by someone with a gun. I frequently use this ability to search for a path I can take to run out of an encounter if things are getting a little too hectic. As soon as 4 or more enemies spot me, I hold down the trigger and assess what my options are and bolt using the vampiric sprint mapped to the left bumper. This bullet time method isn't as beneficial as some of the time slowdown abilities you can unlock in the ability tree, since those allow you to move as normal while everything else is in slow-mo, but it's a great option for reducing the speed of combat and giving yourself an easy advantage without needing to spend any ability points. In the early hours of Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2, I neglected the dodge button heavily since I felt like I was able to compensate for the damage I was taking without dodging by using my vampiric abilities. Little did I know that dodging is an incredibly useful skill that opens up a handful of other opportunities that can be used to dominate combat. For example, attacking while dodging allows you to perform a kick that can push enemies backward. It's incredibly useful to knock back a group of enemies, or if you get lucky with your positioning, you can kick a ghoul off a building to their immediate death. I found it most helpful to dodge backwards out of the way of high damaging red colored attacks and immediately follow up with a kick of my own. A quick note about the glowing red attacks: usually enemies will delay their most powerful attacks a few seconds after it feels like they should be making contact, so make sure to keep that timing in mind as you time out your dodges and counterattacks. Otherwise it can be deadly, which you see here. Speaking of counterattacks, the dodge also functions as a parry to all light melee attacks. If an enemy is winding up to attack you with a punch or with a melee weapon like a bat, if you dodge into them, you'll interrupt the attack and stun them for a few seconds, allowing you to get some solid hits in. With how wide the parry window in Bloodlines 2 is, I found that it was one of the most useful tools when dealing with groups of enemies who were within melee range. There's a fair amount of information that Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines doesn't tell you, but one of the most crucial details that goes largely omitted is the fact that you aren't beholden exclusively to the abilities from the tree of your starting class. Once the game opens up and you have access to vampires from all of the different clans across Seattle, you can visit them to awaken abilities from other class types. To awaken the ability you want, you'll need a specific amount of blood from the 3 blood types of people across Seattle. Once you have enough blood, you can visit the clan representative to spend the blood points for the ability to be added to your ability tree. Once it's in the tree, it can be unlocked with ability points. In the early hours of Bloodlines 2, it's a good idea to stick to unlocking abilities from your starting class, since you'll want as many vampiric abilities at your disposal, and you can only equip 1 ability per row in the tree. Plus, most abilities outside of your starting class typically cost significantly more points to unlock unless your clan has an affinity that lines up with another clan's. That said, if you see something outside of your main tree that you want, it's not a bad idea to save up to buy it to fine-tune your build. Speaking of abilities, many of the abilities you can unlock are made to seem like they're only able to be used on one enemy at a time. While that's true for certain abilities, many can be used on several enemies at once if they're standing close together. For example, the Bladed Hand Strike ability is used to decapitate enemies in an instant. However, if you get a group of enemies to bunch up while in combat, you can behead all of them at the same time. This exploit applies to other abilities as well, which can exponentially increase your lethality and stealth capabilities if used in the right context. When an enemy dies in Bloodlines 2, their body doesn't just become a useless ragdoll, it's still a physics object that you can interact with. This means that once you've killed someone, you actually gain a new tool of sorts that can be used to your advantage. For example, you can throw dead bodies at a charging brute enemy to interrupt their charge and stagger them backwards, opening them up for you to deal out some damage. The most critical use for bodies that I've found, however, is to pick them up and use them as human shields when fighting an enemy who's using a gun. You can block most, if not all, incoming damage when closing the distance between you and a gun-wielding ghoul by picking up a dead body and keeping it between yourself and your enemy. Once you get close, you can then throw the body at your attacker to stun them and then use your vampiric abilities to take them out. As you start to encounter more and more tough enemies with firearms, it's a great idea to keep track of where you've killed an enemy earlier in an encounter and try to keep all options available for assaulting them. If you're not paying close attention, you might miss out on some of the interesting ability combinations you can use in Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2. As you start expanding the ability tree, you'll notice that some skills seem designed to play off one another, allowing you to create brutal combinations that can turn you into a lethal killing machine. For example, if you use Cauldron of Blood on an enemy, which causes other enemies to flock to their position, and then pair it with using Blood Curse, which causes an enemy to explode, you've got a combo that's primed for drastically reducing enemy numbers in just a few seconds. There are plenty of great ability combos, so as you progress through the game, keep an eye out for how you can make abilities play off one another. So those are 7 tips for surviving combat in Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2. It's important to note that fighting isn't always the best choice in the game, so make sure you're exploring all of your options before engaging in combat. For all things Vampire the Masquerade and everything else, make sure to stick with IGN.